anything in it actually going out. I have it on.
Yeah.
But
we could be live, but can somebody in the chat tell us if we're live? You know, we're not mooching off of Caleb's super internet. What's happening here?
Yeah, it's
Is it there?
Yeah,
it says
there.
We are. All right, we're good. Okay. Well, then, Ben, you do the intro.
All right. Well, good evening. Welcome one and all to another episode of Camera and Flask. I have absolutely no idea what number we are up to now. You got any kind of clue?
I would say it's with an asterisk number 55. I'd go with that.
Exactly. You can just make it up. Why change the habit of a lifetime?
Okay.
So welcome one and all. Once again, you will notice that we are a man down this week, sadly. Unfortunately, Caleb is a poorly boy. He's not been very well for the last couple of weeks, but he did manage to struggle to the episode a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
He's still not 100% himself, so get well soon, my friend, and hopefully see you back here next week.
Absolutely.
So you're left. You're stuck with the two of us, I am afraid. Yeah, exactly. So how are you, Jem? What's new?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, a little manic, kind of standard beginning of the year stuff. So sometimes you have a really busy end of year, and then sometimes you have a really quiet end of year. Unfortunately, this time around, end of 2019 was relatively quiet, which just means that when you go into 2020, especially if you have your own company and you're self-employed and everything else, it's just crazy. So good thing is that proposals are going out, projects are starting up, and Bart, you're right. Caleb would have been our Micro Four Thirds guy. Don't get too upset here, and don't get yourself all worked up. Don't think that we're Micro Four Thirds haters completely. So
yourself.
Well, come on. You just said something. All right, we'll see what happens. You're running the show here. So I'm doing all right. But it's a lot of content. I'm trying to do this new series, which you have sort of an auxiliary part of that. You're not in it, but there's a new series I'm putting together. So hoping that's going to go up in a couple of weeks. And how about you, Ben? Where are you in the world right now?
So I'm at home in Czech at the moment, and
Yep.
I'm in a little bit similar boat to you. I had quite a quiet back end of the year. And then January's gone really busy, but with stuff here, which is unusual because most of the time I work away from the Czech Republic. I do very little here. And all of a sudden, really from drinking, which I think is a lesson for us all. Really, you want to go to your local pub,
Unbelievable.
Get hammered with as many people as you can, and come up with wild ideas at 4 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Eve. And that has somehow managed to lead to all kinds of work through various chains of contact, bizarrely. So I've had a meeting in Prague with a great marketing firm who are wanting to do loads of video content and do a series with 2 episodes a month, which would be amazing. I'm really excited about getting on with that. Just everything revving up again after a reasonably sort of quiet January, certainly from a billing point of view. You know what it's like, you get busy again, but it's another month, 6 weeks before you see the cash from that. So I'm looking forward to eating something other than potatoes again. That'll be nice.
And I was in LA last week, so that was great. That was sort of a creative recharge, and it happened right between the SOC and the ASC awards. So basically everybody was in town. So I was running into people, even though I wasn't going to either of those, that I either haven't seen in a while or was doing some great meetings. I missed seeing Tommy Calloway. We were both over at ARI last week. He was checking out, and he's in the chat, the Orbiter. And just a shout out to James Harrison, Lakeshore Studio, for Bart, Knockstrom Digital Media, Tommy, of course, Bart Johnson. Get the hell out of here. I'm just kidding. Oliver, Joe at Alpha Creative, Victor, of course. So there you go. So we've got some good people here. I don't know if I've gotten everybody. Sam, we're hoping that we get some of the other regulars and some new people. And I see Travis here at the top. So there you go. Welcome all. And missing some names here, but maybe they'll show up in a little while. And I guess we're, what are we doing, Ben?
It's that time. You know what we're doing. It's that time. So what are you drinking? Not only you, but what are you in the chat drinking as well? Fill us in.
Okay. So for me today, it is this. It has become a staple. I'm kind of in a sweet Highlands, Speyside-y kind of zone right now. And I'm definitely going to come back to the smoky sweet. Hey, George, good to have you. Good evening,
hello,
sir.
George.
Hey, Mike, I just met at the OMPA event. He is a French transplant to PDX, if I'm allowed to say that, Mike. Am I allowed to share that information? And he has a company with, I believe it's his wife, and they create a lot of stuff just like all of us do. All right, so this is what I'm having right here. It's a 14-year. It's aged in cognac casks. It's quite nice. Lovely, and I've been enjoying it for about $50 US. And there you go. So that's my drink for today. And what about you, Ben, sir?
I am continuing on with this bottle of Rioja, which...
so hopefully it's not 2 weeks old.
Come on. No, it's 2 days old. Come on.
Okay.
Come on.
I was about to say, you said continuing on.
Yeah, continue. Not from last. I don't think I was drinking this last week, was I? I don't know.
Victor's going to BSC. Victor, flying in the morning to London. Aren't you going to get together with Victor?
Yeah. So my plans have changed slightly for this weekend. So the BSC shows, the British Cinematographers show, which is in London on Friday and Saturday this week. It's a really good show. Sorry. Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah, go ahead. Continue.
So it's a mixture of stands. All the gear manufacturers are there. Loads of stuff to go and get your hands on. But also there's a really good program of seminars that run through the 2 days. It's free to go. So if you're in London, the UK, Europe, and you can nip on a cheapy flight, do get over there. And networking, it's really good as well. People tend to decamp to the pub next door in the evenings and have a drink together. It's a good event. So I was going to come in on Friday morning, but I've got a meeting that's quite important in Prague. So I'm going to go to Prague, have that, sleep over at the airport, and be there by about 10 in the morning Saturday, I think.
Got it. Well,
that's my plan.
I've been, it's funny, Bart. I've really been hearing, not just from attendees and from you for a long time, but I've been hearing from manufacturers that BSC is turning out to be their other favorite show along with Cinegear. And it just seems to get better and better every year. And I, for that matter alone, I encourage people to go. A lot less tire kickers, and it seems to be a real show.
Yeah, and that is exactly the case. That it is generally people who are working in the industry at the moment, so it tends to be a lot easier to get your hands on gear, I think, at that particular show. The one thing I will say, it has got quite a lot busier over the last couple of years, and I would say it's maybe getting to the point where it's outgrowing the venue it's in right now.
Interesting.
Just in terms of the seminars, it's a bit the same as Camrimage has done in Poland, which is still a wonderful festival and still absolutely worth going. But it has changed in that the numbers have increased, and getting into screenings and things is not quite as easy as it used to be, but still definitely worth going if you're in and around London this weekend.
Great. Awesome. And it is the British Society of Cinematographers. I mean, that's how they brand it, correct? Is that what the BSC is standing for? Essentially? So it is tied in with that, which means quality of education should be quite high.
The seminars are amazing. That's what you go for. Yeah, the gear stuff, it's nice to see, and it's nice to get your hands on things, but really it's the seminars. Seminars and social.
Now, do you think there's a chance? It hasn't historically been a big show for announcements. Do you think there might be 1 or 2 things that get announced at the show?
The only thing that I remember in recent years, which wasn't announced at the show, but was announced very shortly before, was the Alexa LF. I remember that was the first place that it was really on show. I doubt it. I can't. There's been an awful lot of rumors flying around product-wise today, particularly, which you'll have seen on the Canon front.
Yeah.
But that's not stuff that would be being showcased at that show or tied into that. I don't think it's not that market. So I doubt it. We'll see new products being launched there, but you never know. Things have changed in that front. We've talked about this before, that it always used to be NAB. That was what everything was tied into, and that just is not the case anymore.
Correct. Yeah. It's in fact, it seems to go in these weird cycles where it's no shows and in between shows. All of a sudden, Cine Gear is where the majority of the announcements are. Then at IBC, we have things drop, and then it comes back to NAB, and it's just kind of a weird, no predictability type of cycle now, which I kind of like, because you have these little pockets where things are quiet, and as you remember, towards the end of last year, we just started to see all these kind of things start to drop. So it keeps the conversations going, and we don't have to buy all that stuff. But I would say there's certain shows that are worth going to in terms of networking and meeting people. NAB is a hard one because it's also very much a broadcast show. And I think that the sort of heart of that show has changed a lot in the last 10 years. It sort of went from being very much a broadcast show to Central Hall sort of being this independent filmmaker kind of place, to now sort of a very big mix of things, whereas Cine Gear has no broadcast at all. And I'm assuming that BSC has no broadcast at all in a traditional sense. It's not switchers and satellite trucks and all of that stuff, which is the kind of stuff that I like, and stuff that's more laid back. And I've heard that IBC, you've been to IBC, is very much not either or any of those shows at all. Is that correct?
I find IBC to be a bit of an odd show. I find it slightly fragmented. It's the way that the halls were laid out, and I haven't been for probably the last 3 years, but it didn't have that kind of organization that NAB does. And as you said, Central Hall's kind of where our toys lie. That's where we spend the majority of our time. And then South Hall's post, North Hall's full of all kinds of weird broadcast equipment. And I've found that IBC tends to be, it's all mixed up. And the way the floors are laid out, it's not in the same way these huge halls. It tends to be smaller areas. So it's quite hard to navigate your way around. And I don't find it quite as good socially. I've always been there with friends. We've always had a good time. And Amsterdam's a great city. It's really, really enjoyable week I've always had there. But I haven't found that there's been as many social events tied to the show itself, if that makes sense. Not sort of official parties and things that go on, and that's the thing that I love about NAB, is that it's the people that you get to go and hang out with and meeting new faces all the time.
And that is
IBC just a little harder.
And it's not that I love Las Vegas, I don't, but it is a good city to hang out with people. There's plenty of places to go and just sort of plop down, and it's well suited for that. We'll see if there's any announcements at BSC. And I guess next week, as long as Caleb's feeling better, he'll be in hosting duties, and we could start off the show with any talk about that. And then he'll come up with some sort of topic for next week. Got a question here. Are we excited, or anybody excited, about Red Komodo? I'm excited about it to the extent that I'd like to see what the hell it is. I have some information that it's going to be tiny and modular and high resolution, and we're not going to get there's words for it. We're not going to have to pay exorbitant amounts of money for media, apparently, because of all the things that have happened and the way they're designing that. But I am interested in it. The real question will be, will that camera come into the market and sort of shake things up when it comes to Blackmagic, I would say Zcam, and to a lesser degree Kinfinity, because I think that Zcam is sort of, got momentum right now in terms of what they're doing. So I'm not sure. I mean, I don't expect it when you start building that out to be that way, but we'll have to see that. What's up, Tyler? Tyler's just joining, has new appreciation for the live stream. Just did my first yesterday and had no idea what I was doing. Enjoying a blade and bow.
Join the club.
Yeah, I mean, we have no idea what the hell we're doing, Tyler. Are you kidding? If you're just joining this stream, then you have no idea, because this is the cursed stream of all time. But there you go. Oh, and by the way, just as like a little, and I think next week, I don't know when they publish these, but I think next week I'm going to be on a podcast with Lens Rentals. They have a nice little podcast they're doing now. And then also the workshop that I'm doing at NAB should be up within a week. So I'll put that up on the website and everything else soon. So here we are. Here's the segue: Komodo sensor size and where it lands. Yeah, well, where does it land, Bart? Is it Super 35? It's definitely not full frame or large format, as people like to say. Should I throw some sensors up and you can start this convo going, Ben?
Let's do that. Well, should we start small and work our way up? Should we do that?
Well, yeah, I'm just gonna push a chart out for us to take a look at.
Okay.
I'm going to push this chart out for us to all kind of take a peek. It's not the perfect chart, but it does kind of cover until we get into medium format and VistaVision and sort of IMAX or 65 millimeter. I think it's covering a good portion, and it has that sort of industry standard 2/3 inch sensor. This is provided by APC-C, an article on their website written originally by Andy Shipsides, who is a very knowledgeable person. It's a great article. I'll try to, after the live stream, actually put a link to the article, because I think it's actually, I'm going to try to do it right now while you just start this conversation, because it's really, really, really good. Did I say it's a good article? Here, let's just.
Yeah, you've mentioned that. Yeah, it's good.
So there's a link to the article in the chat, and I think that's definitely worth checking out. Okay.
Okay. I always find this kind of quite an interesting thing, because coming from a photography background, there's a lot of people who do what we do come from that sort of background, that dealing with things smaller than full frame 35 mil when I was starting is a bit of an odd concept. I mean, I think my first, certainly 3 years working as a commercial photographer, I was working entirely on 6:7 medium format. So that's a 6 centimeter by 7 centimeter film. So huge. So that's been quite a change in getting your head around not having that to work with, and obviously thinking around focal lengths that are affected by that and the field of view you get from them. The smallest thing that I've owned sensor-wise, which is interesting because this has been in a box in a cupboard in my house for years. I won this at a raffle at Super Meet at NAB the year that it was launched. This is the Pocket Cinema camera, the first one, when it still actually did fit in a pocket. And I dug this out for a job this week, and I think it might be the first actual bit of work I've ever used it on. Now, the sensor size on this is minuscule. This is Super 16 size, so it's a micro four thirds mount, but the sensor size is Super 16, so you're kind of doubling your focal lengths to get a full frame 35 mil equivalent. If that makes sense. So yeah, I used this for a time lapse this week, indoors, powered obviously, because the batteries last about 5 minutes on this thing. Literally 5 minutes, that's all, and it's gone. So I leave it in for a time lapse in case the power supply goes off over that whole week that this thing was running for. It's come out beautifully. It's really good because it's a really nice log image off it going into ProRes HQ in camera. It cuts in really nicely with all the Canon RAW stuff that I've been shooting for the rest of that project. So that's the smallest thing that I've dealt with.
I will say that the original pocket camera and the 2.5K, until recently, with some of the new sensors, like the G2 sensor is nice now that they've got their color science more worked out. Those two cameras from Blackmagic were my two favorite sensors. And the big problem that we have with sensors is not just the size of the sensors. It's the fact that they're all different. So, unlike Arri, who puts the same sensor and has put the same sensor or multiples of the same sensor into a camera body for the past 11 years, pretty much everybody else at best is putting their sensor in 2 or 3 of their cameras, and then all of the other cameras have different sensors. So, Blackmagic is a great example of that. Their first cameras all had different sensors in them, and people became partial to certain ones and the way they sort of tuned those. And I actually really liked that camera that you have, you had in your hand. And it was truly a pocket camera, but you couldn't power it off of a power bank. It lasted for 5 minutes on the battery. It's an older camera, but it was shooting RAW to SD cards. It was a game changer. I mean, it was really, in terms of what you could do, for sure.
Someone time this. This is a full battery that's in here right now. I've just turned it on. I'll tell you when it dies.
Okay, perfect.
If you're unfamiliar with this camera, that's exactly the point. This camera produces a beautiful image off it. It really does, but it's completely unusable in this format. You need to rig this out so much to use it for anything. So really, I find the sensor size to be quite restrictive in terms of being able to get anything very wide on it, because it's so small, obviously. So this 14 becomes a 28 equivalent for full frame equivalence. And as you say, the power is just terrible. The screen on it is pretty much unusable.
Is it by the time one though? Because if I push this sensor thing, the one sensor that's missing on here is micro four thirds, and the micro four thirds sensor is actually larger than Super 16.
It is
smaller than Super 35. So I'm thinking that the crop might actually be even worse than that. Of course, there's a trend now, which is pretty interesting. We're seeing most of the cameras on the market are some version of APS-C or Super 35, the majority of them. And then you have these sort of in-betweeners, and then we have the cameras that they used to call full frame, but now that we're talking about digital cinema cameras, they like to call them large format or full format, which I think is just confusing the issue even more in terms of stuff. And then on top of that, you can go to Abel Cine's website. They have a sensor chart. There's, you'll look down at 6 or 7 cameras that are all essentially Super 35 millimeter cameras. They're digital sensors, and none of them really have the same exact size as true Super 35 millimeter film, or the same size as each other. So there's variations. And we're not even talking about resolution, of course. You can have a 4K Super 35 millimeter sensor, and you can have a 2K Super 35 millimeter sensor. And now you're also basically getting into a situation where you can shoot on a camera, Sony, Canon, and other camera companies, where you'll have a full frame or 35 millimeter sensor, and then you can go into crop modes where basically you're shooting at a Super 35 field of view, you're shooting at a Super 16 field of view, which opens up in a good way options in terms of how you can shoot with the cameras, but also the lenses that you can use, because every lens has an image circle. And regardless of focal length, the image circle has to be big enough to cover the film or sensor size that you're capturing to. And that's really important to understand. A 100 millimeter lens is a 100 millimeter lens. But if the image circle is not big enough, then it won't be able to cover the sensor size that you're trying to shoot with on that camera. Bart has a question. Can we maybe, so might be jumping ahead, but isn't digital S35 or Super 35 actually the closest to the size of a cell of 35 millimeter motion picture film? No. The answer is no, because original 35 millimeter film was like full frame 35 millimeter. How that film is going through the gate and how much of that actual film is being used could vary depending on the type of content that you were capturing. Did it need to capture sound? Was it full? We sometimes call that open gate, where it's basically using the entire amount of the film, all the way to basically the we call it sprockets, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the perforations, and often those standards are actually
exactly.
by it's like 3 per 6 per whatever
3
it
perf,
is.
4 perf, exactly.
Exactly.
Sprocket going into those. So the answer is no. Actually, in the 90s is really when the explosion of super 35 millimeter film came into motion picture capture in a huge way. And it happened to be, at least my understanding, to be the most cost effective from sort of start to finish. So from the beginning of the film itself all the way through processing, Super 35 wasn't necessarily the best size and format that you could be capturing on, but it was and became sort of a standard. So it was something that they kind of pipelined in a way that so many films then were captured with Super 35 millimeter film. And then in turn, when they started to develop and create digital sensors, it was pretty obvious that going with a Super 35 millimeter equivalent digital sensor would make a lot of sense when you were making that crossover, especially because you had DPs and cinematographers who were used to saying, hey, I want a 28 millimeter lens. And they would get a predictable result because they were used to putting that lens on Super 35 millimeter camera systems that have and were shooting in Super 35 millimeter film. So now you have a digital cinema camera that has essentially the same digital sensor size, or at least close. And so when you put that lens onto that camera, you're going to get a similar equivalent. And the other thing to note, and then I'll let you jump in, is that there were a shitload of lenses that had been developed for that film size. So it wasn't like there was a million full frame or 35 millimeter lenses there for cinema at that point. Sure, there were for legacy film cameras, but the majority of lenses that people were shooting on, master primes and all of these other things, they were designed for essentially Super 35 millimeter camera systems. So it made a lot of sense for Panavision and Arri and all of these companies to say, let's go ahead and make a sensor that can basically use the coverage, the image circle of those lenses that were being created for production. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense? I hope so.
It does make sense. And then there's another interesting little tidbit as a kind of slight variation from Super 35 that often gets referred to when we're talking about DSLRs, is we're talking about APS-C, which I believe is very slightly different, but it's more or less the same. And APS-C was an odd format from, I guess, the 90s, which was sort of a competitor to 35mm film. So there were a lot of compact cameras that came out, I would say, late 90s.
Yep.
That were shooting on this. It was like a little cartridge. So I think the film manufacturers at the time, I think Kodak were one of the leaders in that, were making it easier for you to load film. People were scared of having to get the film out of the canister or double exposing it. My mum used to do this. She had a camera which didn't wind the tail back in at the end. So we'd have like 4 years of family holidays on the same film, just overlaid.
Yep.
That happened all the time. So that's what the APS-C designation is that you sometimes see. That's where that comes from. It didn't last very long, that format.
It was, well, it did last a long time, though, because it became a digital sensor size. But it was, you remember, it stands for Advanced Photo
System. Advanced Photo System, yeah.
And many of the kind of the whole sell was that it was a self-contained thing, and you would pop it in the camera, and then it would self-wind it onto there. So it was kind of a brainless way of loading stuff. So a lot of those APS-C cameras, as far as I remember. But what we got out of it was we got that essentially capture size that was also translated. And of course, it's or was a lot less expensive to manufacture a digital still camera with an APS-C size sensor as opposed to a full frame sensor. if you look at the difference, do we have APS-C? Well, we'll just take the super 35 millimeter film size that we see there.
Yeah, close enough.
Close enough. And you compare it to full frame, and in actual physical size, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it, I think you're getting almost twice the size of sensor area in a full frame or full format in terms of actual physical sensor stuff. And so twice the size means a lot more in manufacturing costs and all of those other fun things. So yeah, there you go.
I think it's now quite interesting. I'm about to rent a red Epic W, the 8K, for a job next week that has a very odd specification. And looking at the coverage of the lenses for that, it's quite interesting because that's Super 35, but it's a little bit bigger.
Yep.
So if you're wanting, if you want the full 8K readout, which I absolutely have to have for this particular job, I can't use a lot of Super 35 lenses because they will not cover it without vignetting.
Interesting.
So all these things that you read and you go, well, that's Super 35, so I can use lenses that have been manufactured to that standard, not necessarily.
Yep.
I'm finding forums a very good source of working out which lenses are going to work with that camera. So it's kind of a bit of a minefield, really.
Yep. Chris says he's using a camera with 3 CMOS 2/3 inch sensors right now, and I love it. Reminds me of the awesome camcorder days 15 years ago. I don't know if you're being facetious or not, Chris. I mean, there are still places for small chip cameras, 2/3 inch, 1 inch. I find that if you have enough light to get exposure, that one of the most important places to consider smaller sensor cameras is actually in event situations, because it's very hard to shoot things like sports and arenas and concerts and even multicam talks like TED Talks without having small chip cameras, because the equivalent field of view that you're getting on a certain focal length is totally different than if you were using a larger sensor camera. So, one of the key advantages to going 35 millimeter full frame or full format or large format or whatever the F you want to call it is not that you can't get the same depth of field out of a super 35 millimeter camera or even a micro 4/3 camera. It's the spatial component of it. How close do you have to be, or how far away do you have to be from your subject matter to get the depth of field that you're trying to achieve? And one of the big advantages to going with a larger sensor is that you can physically put yourself into a smaller space, and you can put a lens on there and you can see more of the space, but you can start to reach shallower depths of field more easily. Whereas the opposite is true of those small sensors. You can sit at the back of a football field or a concert hall or whatever it is. You wouldn't be at the back of a football field, that, but you'd be, somewhere shooting from, let's say football traditional on the pitch, if you're on a football field, American football, wherever you are, and you need to have smaller sensors. You have plenty of light so that you can reach and get the field of view that you're looking for from those particular cameras. So I still think that there's huge advantages. And there's a lot of people who feel that micro 4/3, especially now with the advances in low light capabilities, GH5S is a perfect example of that, are giving you sort of that nice in between. And then by taking a speed booster, which is important because it has a piece of glass on it, which is essentially effectively increasing your field of view, allowing you to use, lenses that are basically going to give you different depths of field than you would get to get the same field of view if you were on a smaller sensor. Those are huge advantages to people in production. I get a little bit scared of speed boosters and anything that I'm putting in front of a camera that has an additional piece of glass, because I think about two things. What's the quality of the glass? Because you're only as good as the worst piece of glass that's sitting in front of your sensor. And then the second thing is, it's just another thing to get dust and dirt on. And, it's it's easy to get dust and dirt on all of these things. So that's some of the things that I think about. Yeah.
I'm of the same opinion. Just going back to what you were saying a little earlier, I did quite a lot of conference. Someone's Lakeshore Studio just been talking about shooting a TEDx event recently on a GH4 with Sigma lenses. I did quite a bit of conference operating. So it's essentially you're working like a live studio type broadcast. So you've got the headset on and you're being directed. But the flexibility of having that small sensor camera, being able to punch in and actually still having a bit of a decent depth of field on the longer end of those lenses, really easy. It's not an awful lot of the work that I've done, but it just seems, it's quite surprising when you're used to working with bigger sensors, how much flexibility that format gives you. Yeah. And going back to what you were saying about then using speed boosters in between, to me, it's just another thing to go wrong. It's just, and I shot with Sony cameras with speed boosters for 3 or 4 years, I would say, before I switched back fully to Canon last year. Yeah. But one of the main reasons I wanted to do that was because I just wanted to get everything back onto sort of native mounts and not having anything in between. The speed boost I didn't really have any problems with during that time, although I have to say that my 1635 lens was always weird with a speed booster or any kind of adapter, never seemed to work properly. To the point where I was convinced the lens was wrong and I sent it off for service to be recalibrated. And they go, no, nothing wrong with it, it's fine. But no. Now it's on back and Canon bodies, it all works okay. Yeah. So I'm of the exact same opinion.
Yeah.
Worked great, but there's just something about it for me that just sort of screams of sort of reliability issues or potential reliability issues.
Yep.
I think.
What's the question here? What do we got? Jem, what camera would you pick to film educational content? Good question. Well, I think for your money, when you're in situations that are similar to what I'm in a lot of the time, that Super 35 APS-C makes a lot of sense. Studios are not generally huge, but they're also, they're not super tiny. So it's kind of that in between. It's a similar kind of space that we walk into very oftentimes when we're shooting interviews. And so distance to camera really depends, but I would say it's sort of 6 to 10 feet away from subject matter. So I find that a camera system that has a really strong AF system makes a lot of sense. And then a lot of it boils down to what lenses you have in your kit. So if I'm looking at, for instance, cameras that are on the market today, I'm probably looking at C300 Mark II with the touch focus kit, C200. I'm looking at the new FX9 from Sony, and I know that that's a full frame sensor, but there's no disadvantage to that. I think that once you start to get into a C500 Mark II, you might be going slightly overkill. For educational-based content, I think you'd be better off spending your money on lenses. And I have to say that a big difference when you're shooting this type of stuff is having sharp lenses. So I find that having this I don't have it on right now, but the 24-70 version 2 from Canon is, again, not an exciting lens, but it's kind of a rock star lens when it comes to just sort of the sharpness. So I'm trying to shoot all my A camera stuff with that. There's obviously better lenses out there. If I put primes on my cameras and I have somebody who's taking the time to focus, and that's another reason that I think the Canon cameras have a win, is that they have a focus assist feature that you can use with virtually any manual lens. And there's a little box and it will tell you when you're tack sharp in terms of your focus. And they're starting to put that into their mirrorless cameras as well. I believe that the 1DX Mark III has that. I don't know what Bart's saying, but I'm going to say show. It's making me, what word is he using there? Huge, maybe? Maybe sensor, the word size and huge are in there. So maybe that's why it was flagging it. I don't know about that.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm feeling Caleb's absence as well, Rob. We all miss Caleb. Quite honestly, it's not good not having him on the show, and his voice is very important, especially when we're talking about subjects like this. everybody can create great content with all of these camera systems. I just struggle without a speed booster, with Micro Four Thirds, with the type of content that I'm trying to create. And there are times where you want to go deeper depth of field. I think long term, there's going to be a lot more discussions, which is totally like, turning the corner and going down a different road. But it's kind of like that conversation about everybody's using soft light right now, Ben. And, I'm starting to get sick of it. And I'm starting to introduce more hard light into what I'm doing and how I'm lighting. And I know that's a different conversation, but I think it's also a similar conversation, is that, I have a friend who's a DP based out of LA, and he loves shooting 16 millimeter. Super 16 is one of his favorite things to shoot on. And I think he loves getting the reach, and he likes the depth of field, and it doesn't all have to be. Yeah.
And he's shooting on film in Super 16 though.
No, he just likes that field of view. So it's not always film. And he wishes that he loved it when they came out with the digital Bolex, because to him, that was like the bee's knees to be able to shoot with those depth of field properties. And there's a lot of amazing stuff that's been shot on Super 16, a lot of narrative stuff that's been shot on Super 16. So it's just finding that balance. But then on the flip side, you'll find a lot of cinematographers who say, we don't like to be far away from our subject the way you might be sometimes in documentary and things like that. And they'll want to be close. They want to be in that space with their actors, and they want to shoot on wider lenses. And that, of course, is going to give you a deeper depth of field, even with a larger sensor area.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was going to say, one of the things that I think is my slight aversion to those smaller sensor sizes and Micro Four Thirds. I think if that is what your system is, that's what you're shooting on entirely, and you're buying lenses entirely for that system that have been designed for that system.
Yeah.
That's an entirely different thing to, I guess, what we were talking about, because we've got lenses that I'm guessing generally EF, that we're then converting down to other things, and that's when it becomes a pain. I think if you're stuck into that one system, I think it's a different thing entirely.
Yeah. I also think yeah, go ahead.
The other thing, just going back to the Super 16 stuff, when you're talking about that from a film point of view as well, there's a very much an aesthetic to film that's been shot on Super 16 because of the grain structure and the grain size. It's obviously bigger, so it's a coarser film, but it has that very nice look, which is still quite popular. There's still quite a lot of stuff gets shot on that.
Yeah. I think that the other thing that people get confused with, and look, I get confused if I'm not talking about this and using these different sensor sizes, it makes my brain hurt for sure sometimes, is that, and I said it a little bit earlier, a lens's focal length is a lens's focal length. And so if you are shooting on a Micro Four Thirds camera natively without a speed booster to change anything, without another piece of glass in front of there, then you essentially, compared to full frame 35 millimeter, you essentially have a 2-to-1 ratio, right? So you're thinking about putting a 12 millimeter lens on there to get effectively a 24, 25 millimeter equivalent field of view, but it's still a 12 millimeter lens, which means that it's going to generally give you a very deep depth of field. Even though your field of view is closer to 24, it becomes even more obvious when you're shooting with a 35 millimeter lens and you're getting a field of view which is closer to a 70. That's starting to get into portrait, close to telephoto. You would expect the bokeh to be, really shallow in the background, but you'll find that when you put that 35 on a Micro Four Thirds camera, even in f2.8, you're getting essentially the depth of field that you would get at a 35 millimeter focal length on a full frame. You're just not seeing as much of the world there. And that can really make your brain hurt. There is a thing called circles of confusion, which depending on the day I understand and other days I don't, which can have some effect on that. But effectively, your focal length of your lens and your glass is having a dramatic impact along with your aperture in terms of what your depth of field properties are going to be. So that's important to always remember. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I guess then looking at where we are and where things are going, it's quite interesting that over the last 12 months that we've seen this start of digital cinema cameras, and not at stupid money now, going for full frame.
Yes.
Which is excellent. I'm very happy about this. I would absolutely, I'm still shooting with the C200 light. I still love that camera, but I would take the C500 over it for the full frame alone any day of the week if my budget would stretch to that.
Yeah.
Right now,
I mean, there's no question. And the fact that on that camera, you can essentially go into a menu and you can change it from full frame to Super 35 to Super 16. Just even if you're using full frame glass, I mean, it just opens up so many more possibilities to you that are beyond just being able to zoom. I mean, a lot of the people here in the chat have probably used an A7 series camera before. And the fact that you can put a prime lens on there and you can essentially zoom from a 20, if you're shooting in HD, you can zoom from a 25 millimeter to effectively a 50 millimeter field of view, not 50 millimeter lens, but field of view, gives you tremendous freedom in terms of the things that you can do. So it's a big deal that we're starting to get those options in these cameras. And, you know, the resolution game is not going to completely end, but it's really nice to see that we're starting to see some of this functionality that's giving us creatively other options, because there's times where you're shooting and you have a 24 to 70 or a 24 to 105 or whatever that lens is that you have on your camera system, and you're shooting something and you don't have time to switch to another lens, or you're in a condition in an environment where you're just not going to change a lens. And the fact that you can take a C500 Mark II and a number of other cameras from Sony and other manufacturers, and you can say, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and switch this over to Super 35, or in an extreme condition into Super 16. You've just completely changed your field of view of what you can capture at that resolution on the camera. And now all of a sudden you're capturing a 4K, sometimes, you know, subsampled from that higher resolution. You're going to get an amazing quality image out of that. Just don't expect your depth of field to change, you know, drastically. Yeah. So that's important. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that a lot of particularly the cine lens manufacturers, have now been making things that have the full frame coverage over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, that their new lens lines have been coming out covering that.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, do you think that we will see digital cinema cameras, mainstream, not niche stuff, going beyond full frame, what they're referring to as large format, which to me isn't large format, that's full frame 35. Do you think we're going to see things pushing to a 645 or beyond in terms of what we would think of as medium format?
Well,
center sizes, or to 60?
Yes. I mean, that's what the Alexa 65 is in effect, in a very expensive package, only rentable, not even buyable.
Exactly. So that's what I'm talking about niche. So that exists right now. There are systems that do
well,
that.
I mean, without question, Fujifilm is the one that's going to probably drive that. I mean, as a company, at least to date, they've made a decision, which is they're going to leave that 35 millimeter full frame, we'll say, because that's how we've been describing it for the last few years, alone. And they're going to stick to their essentially APS-C Super 35 millimeter cameras, and they're going to go medium format, right? And they're not making full frame lenses, right? And as an ecosystem, they're as close to an Apple as you can get. If we want to talk about a camera company that's the Apple of camera companies, it's Fujifilm, because they're making the camera bodies, they're making the lenses. I'm not saying they're the only company that's doing it, but they're very clearly going down 2 paths, and they're saying, here's our iPad, and, you know, here's our MacBook Pro or whatever, or our Mac Pro, whatever you want to, analogy you want to say is there. And they've added video features now to their medium format cameras, and I can't see them keeping those features exactly the same. I can just see them getting better. So if there's one company who's going to get there first, potentially, it's going to be Fujifilm for your IMAX camera in your pocket. I think that the other one, and Bart just brought it up, but I would agree, is is DJI, which owns Hasselblad. If you don't know that DJI owns Hasselblad, they own Hasselblad. So they're the other company that could really come into this and say, hey, look, we're going to go medium format. And that would be pretty interesting as well.
So a question on the Fuji and the medium format digital video that exists in their cameras right now. What is that pushing out resolution wise and in terms of file format wise?
So it's 4K GFX cameras, not ridiculous. I don't even think they're at a 400 megabits per second right now. I'd have to look at that 50 and that 100 camera. It's not something I've seen beyond. Maybe somebody can actually comment on the chat in terms of that. We'd have to look it up, or if somebody wants to look it up in terms of those cameras. But they are for sure shooting video. They're for sure capturing it. I think they're doing a form of HDR. Yeah, go ahead.
And is it full sensor readout? Or are we
my understanding it is. My understanding it is, but I'm not 100% sure. Full sensor, but 4K. So it's not like 6K or 8K that you're getting out of that. It's definitely not an XT3 in terms of video functionality. The AF's not there. Some of the other stuff's not there. But we could all just stop. And as Chris says, we can all make shirts. Let's do it. Ridiculous. What do we have up in the chat here? Oh, here we go. So Fuji Medium does line skipping, but you get the full sensor. So Henry says that. Why don't you want to be a B-roll bro, Bart? That could be a thing. It would be bad. You'd look back on it and you would regret it, but you could be a B-roll bro. That's a bad thing. Philip Bloom has made some really nice stuff with the Fuji medium format camera. Yeah. Do bigger sensors and higher data rates need more cooling? Yes. To keep
absolutely.
a consistent temperature to avoid color shifting. 360. Good to have you. Yes. I mean, one of the challenges, Ben, can you lift up that camera again, that little pocket camera? One of the reasons that camera can be that size and actually fit in your pocket and shoot RAW. It's not Blackmagic RAW, but it can shoot RAW to SD cards, is because it's effectively a full HD camera. If that camera was a 4K camera and you wanted to shoot at higher data rates, then you would have a 4K pocket camera, Blackmagic pocket camera, which is not. Yeah.
And this is what, when everyone was whining about that camera when it came out, the 4K, that there is just so much that physics can do until you're getting into ridiculous money in terms of very fancy materials for dissipating heat with heat sinks that aren't using fans. And then that's another whole problem of noise and power draw and all that good stuff too. So, that I think that's always been the hint. I mean, part of you thinks, well, maybe that there's part of this that it's a slow evolution anyway as the technology goes, but a lot of it has been down to the data rates that are coming off those things and what you do with that and how quickly you can process it. And obviously there's that moves on slowly, but also it's the heat and how you get rid of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of similarities between what we have to deal with when it comes to camera systems and light fixtures. I've said this before, there's a misconception by a lot of people that LED lighting and LED diodes do not produce a lot of heat. They produce tremendous amounts of heat, but it's the way that they're separated, the way that heat is dissipated, that allows them to be more efficient in some ways than traditional quartz halogen and other hot light technology, which tend to be coming from a single source point. But if you really look at LED technology, as soon as you get into chip on board lights, which has tons of little LEDs with phosphor in it in a cluster, there's a reason that there are fan units and heat sinks, and that the units are getting bigger when it comes to these 300 D2s and the Forza 500. There's only so much you can do without actually allowing air cooling and heat sink and basically fans to come into the equation. And cameras are no different. In fact, in many ways, it's worse because our expectation is we want to go higher frame rate. We want to go higher resolution. More importantly, we want to go higher data rate. That bit rate is such a huge part of what we can actually do with an image. Bit depth and color sampling is also part of that, but the actual data rate itself is huge, and it's probably one of the reasons that up until now the A7 series is really locking you into an 8-bit, but also into 100 megabits per second in UHD 4K. Because they just can't, they can't do it without having overheating issues. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Which also brings me on to, because we're 5 minutes away, and I wanted to talk about this because I think it's quite relevant. So I don't know if guys in the chat as well, you can fill me in on the specs that you've seen for these new Canon mirrorless cameras that are being bandied about on the rumor sites today.
No.
It seems to me that the specs of the new EOS R5 or 6, I can't remember what they're thinking it's going to be called, and this is all rumor. They were reckoning that it's going to be 8K, 5-axis in-body stabilization with 5 stops of stabilization on it, and that it was going to shoot 8K RAW in full frame. Now,
do you get a swimming pool with it, or at least an aquarium to carry it around in? What's the deal?
At some point, physics kicks in. If you think about the way that Sony released cameras and features in their camera sets, and then you look at the way that Canon have done that, albeit they have had a little shift in the last year or so, whereas Sony have just gone, yeah, we could put that in a camera, stick it in, do it now, now. Whereas Canon, it's maybe we'll think about doing that in a year or two. We've kind of got this roadmap. We're already going down. I know there's new stuff, but we're not going to do that right now. We're going to keep going down the path we were on. So if Sony haven't been able to do any of that stuff internally and having those even at 4K, getting the 10-bit and the higher bit rate, to be doing 8K in RAW in something that size is crazy. That said, of course, that the 1DX Mark III is doing 4K RAW internally. So we will see. But it seems bizarre that they would bring out a product which would be lower down their product line that would have that functionality.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. And Victor brings up the Sigma FP camera, which is really an interesting one.
Really interesting.
I don't know why you're capitalizing the FP. I think we got to go small FP because it's so small. But it's an interesting little camera. I can't really talk to it because I haven't really seen it. It's something that I have to try, and this would be where Caleb would come in. And again, we miss him and hope him the best in recovery. It's not like he's dying, everybody. He's just he's in a household with kids. I remember one winter, Ben, back in New Jersey, we literally started having people get sick in the house at the beginning of November, and I don't think it was until around Easter time that there wasn't a sick person in the house. So sometimes it just cycles around, and it's just ugly.
Oh, if you've got kids in the school in the winter, you're coming down with stuff. There's no way of avoiding it. Everyone in my house, my kids have been off school. Both of them are off school today. Yeah, well, exactly. There's apparently that the Czech way of getting yourself better if you're feeling rough is that you need a hat and a bottle of whiskey. And what you do is you lie down on your bed and you put the hat on one of your feet, and then you keep drinking until the hat appears to be on both your feet, and that is the correct amount of alcohol to have to cure you of any ailment. Top tip for you.
I don't know who Daniel Scott Design is, but he's saying mean things. That ain't Cameron Flask. We like to take the piss over here, but we don't do RIP. That's out of control, especially this week. But there you go. So
I missed some. Okay.
No, I'm just. Oh yeah, you haven't been tracking with that. I'm just. There you go. Let me see. My wife blamed me for getting us both sick recently. I pointed out that I work at home by myself all the time.
I use the exact same.
So excuse. Funny. That's good. Good. Well, we made it through without Caleb. I don't like to. And we needed his voice in this particular episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was important. But next week, and he'll be back, and it'll be a beautiful thing. And some good chat here today. I have to bring up the stuff while you kind of do the closer here, because I have to figure out how to push the logo and everything.
All right. I'll let you. You've got your concentrating face on. So again, thank you very much for showing up every week. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it and how much we enjoy hanging out with you all. This really has pretty much become my social life. Our Wednesday night get-togethers. So please do subscribe to Jem's channel to keep up to date with all the amazing content that he makes, as well as keeping notifications coming in about when we're doing this, which is every week at this time, midnight in Central Europe, 11 p.m. in the UK, 3 p.m. in the west coast of the US, and 6 p.m. on the east.
And
amazing. I don't think I caught any of that up.
And if you don't feel well, just saying, it could work. My wife sent me an article.
It does work.
I don't drink it. It's if you have a wee dram is all we're talking about here. You're not sitting there drinking a half a bottle. Thank you, Tyler.
No, mix it with ginger and honey.
Yeah,
that's what you do.
Yeah,
ginger, honey, lemon, whiskey.
Kind of a Scottish mule to make you better. You don't mean ginger beer though. You mean actual ginger, like boil it up.
Yeah, I mean actual ginger. Yeah. Like grated ginger into a cup, honey, whiskey.
I'm a little scared. I see Victor says, "See you Saturday, Ben!" ! We should do social things. So I don't know if we'll see Ben next week's episode. We'll see what happens. He might be doing another video for a pub, the Slaughtered Lamb in the East End of London. We'll see what happens. So
maybe this is going to be such an incredibly quick trip this time. I'm actually going to London for the day. I'm having one night in London and then coming straight back again. So it'll be good. And Jago, sorry, I missed that you were here. Hello, my friend.
Hey, Jago. All the best. More content coming next week. New show coming up in a couple of weeks, hopefully. That will be in addition to the content that's here on the channel. Please subscribe. Love you guys and gals and everybody who comes to the chat. And let's get these numbers up. Let people know about what we talk about. If you know people who like geek speak when it comes to video production, filmmaking, and all the stuff that we talk about here on the show, tell them to come by. If they don't like it, they'll know within a minute or two, and they'll just leave. And if they do,
or frankly, anyone who's just a bit of a boozer and's got nothing better to do on a Wednesday night, because what else are you going to be doing?
That too. Why not? Or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah. All the best, everyone. I'm going to push the logo now, and we'll see how this all works. I'm trying here. Okay, here we go.